Imagine being a child who feels everything too loudly, thinks everything too deeply, and loves everything too fiercely, in a world that keeps asking you to feel less, think quieter, and love more carefully. Imagine carrying that weight not in the privacy of your own home, but under the gaze of a world that has already decided who you are supposed to be, how you are supposed to behave, and what you are supposed to become before you have even had the chance to discover any of those things for yourself. Now imagine that the one place you should feel safest, the institution, the household, the system built around you, has no language for what you are experiencing, no protocol, no room. Now, stop imagining, because for millions of children around this world, that is not a hypothetical. That is Tuesday morning. That is the school run. That is the formal event where everyone is watching and nobody is truly seeing. That is the silence after a diagnosis that a family carries alone because they are too afraid of what the world will say if they speak it out loud. We gather today not to speak about weakness. We gather today because silence has had its turn, and it has failed our children long enough. When a child is identified early as having a neurodevelopmental condition, the entire course of their life can shift in ways that are difficult to fully quantify but impossible to ignore. Early diagnosis is not simply a label, it is a doorway. It opens access to therapies, educational accommodations, behavioral support systems, and specialist interventions that would otherwise remain out of reach or arrive too late to make their fullest impact. The human brain, particularly in the first several years of life, possesses a quality that neuroscientists refer to as neuroplasticity, the remarkable ability to reorganize, rewire, and adapt based on experience and stimulation. When targeted interventions are introduced during this window, the brain responds with a flexibility that simply is not available in later years. A child who receives speech therapy at age 3 will almost always make greater progress than one who begins at age 10. Not because the older child is less capable, but because the developmental window has partially closed. Beyond the clinical dimension, early diagnosis also gives parents and caregivers a framework for understanding behaviors that might otherwise be misread as defiance, laziness, or emotional instability. It transforms confusion into clarity. It replaces frustration with compassion. It allows families to stop asking, "What is wrong with my child?" and begin asking the far more productive question, "What does my child need, and how do we provide it?" Communities, schools, and healthcare systems that invest in early screening and diagnosis are not simply being medically responsible, they are making a profound moral statement about which children they believe deserve support and which lives they consider worth investing in from the very beginning. Despite decades of awareness campaigns, despite the explosion of mental health conversations in media and popular culture, despite the very public journeys of celebrities and royals who have spoken about their struggles, stigma around childhood neurodevelopmental and mental health diagnoses remains deeply, stubbornly present in society. It wears different faces in different contexts. In working-class communities, it may show up as a reluctance to label a child, born from a genuine fear that a diagnosis will follow them forever and close doors, rather than open them. In elite and high-profile environments, it manifests as an institutional pressure to project wellness, capability, and composure at all times. Because vulnerability is perceived as weakness, and weakness is perceived as a threat to reputation, legacy, or social standing. Stigma is particularly damaging when it operates within families themselves. When grandparents dismiss concerns as, "He's just being a boy," or "Children didn't have all these diagnoses in our day," they are not simply being old-fashioned. They are actively creating an environment where a child's genuine needs go unmet and a parent's instincts are undermined. The result is delay. And in the world of child development, delay has consequences. Every month that passes without proper support is a month of missed developmental opportunity. Stigma also shapes how children come to understand themselves. A child who senses that their diagnosis is a source of shame within their own household will internalize that shame. They will learn to mask their struggles, suppress their instincts, and perform a version of normalcy that costs them an enormous amount of daily energy. Energy that should be spent learning, growing, playing, and simply existing without the exhausting weight of concealment pressing down on them every single day. There is a particular and underappreciated cruelty in growing up under observation. Most children are afforded the grace of obscurity. They can stumble, regress, struggle, and recover without an audience. Their bad days are witnessed only by those who love them. Their developmental quirks are noted only by their teachers and pediatricians. But children who are born into public life, whether through royal lineage, political family, celebrity household, or any other form of inherited visibility, do not have access to that grace. Every public appearance becomes a performance. Every expression captured in a photograph becomes subject to analysis, commentary, and viral speculation. Crowds, cameras, formal events, rigid protocols. These are not the natural habitat of childhood, and for a child with sensory sensitivities, anxiety disorders, or neurodevelopmental differences, they can be genuinely overwhelming environments that bear very little resemblance to the therapeutic and structured spaces where such children genuinely thrive. The public eye also creates a dangerous dynamic in which behavior is constantly being interpreted by people who have no clinical training, no relationship with the child, and no access to the full context of their life. A child who covers their ears in a crowd may be dismissed as rude. A child who avoids eye contact in a formal setting may be described as odd or troubled. These surface-level readings, amplified by social media and tabloid culture, put enormous pressure on families to manage perception rather than prioritize genuine well-being. In trying to protect a child from public misunderstanding, families sometimes inadvertently delay the very conversations and interventions the child most urgently needs. One of the most important intellectual and cultural shifts of the past 2 decades has been the gradual movement away from a purely deficit-based model of understanding conditions like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and sensory processing disorder, toward a framework that recognizes these not as broken versions of a normal mind, but as genuinely different cognitive architectures, each with its own profile of challenges and strengths. The neurodiversity paradigm does not deny that these conditions can create real difficulties. It does not romanticize struggle or pretend that a child with severe sensory processing challenges finds daily life easy. What it does insist upon is that difficulty and deficit are not the same thing. A mind that processes the world differently is not a mind that is processing it incorrectly. Many of the qualities associated with neurodevelopmental conditions, intense focus, pattern recognition, heightened sensitivity, original thinking, exceptional memory, and specific domains, are not incidental side effects. They are genuine cognitive strengths that, when properly supported and channeled, can lead to extraordinary contributions in art, science, technology, literature, and human connection. History is filled with individuals whose neurological profiles would almost certainly attract a clinical label today, and whose differences were inseparable from their genius. The danger of framing neurodevelopmental conditions purely as problems to be fixed is that it communicates to the child, from the very beginning of their self-awareness, that something is fundamentally wrong with the way they exist in the world. That message is not neutral. It shapes identity, erodes confidence, and can produce a lifelong relationship with one's own mind that is characterized by shame rather than curiosity, by self-correction rather than self-expression, by the exhausting and ultimately futile project of becoming someone they were never designed to be. When a parent chooses to speak openly about their child's diagnosis, particularly a parent whose life unfolds in any degree of public view, the ripple effects extend far beyond their own household. There is a reason that the mental health community consistently identifies high-profile disclosure as one of the most powerful tools available for reducing stigma and increasing help-seeking behavior across entire populations. It is not because celebrity or status gives a person's experience more inherent value. It is because visibility normalizes. When a family that the public admires, respects, or simply recognizes demonstrates that they have navigated the terrain of a child's diagnosis with honesty and love, they give permission to every other family watching to do the same. The parent who shares their journey, even imperfectly, even with boundaries, even without disclosing every clinical detail, becomes an inadvertent advocate for every child whose parents are still sitting in silence, too afraid or too proud or too overwhelmed to ask for help. Parental advocacy also takes forms that never reach the public. It happens in school meetings where a parent insists, against institutional resistance, that their child deserves an individualized education plan. It happens in family gatherings where a parent quietly but firmly redirects a dismissive comment from a relative.